Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you a lecture today on westward expansion based on Chapter 7. This slideshow presentation is pretty long. I'm not going to go over every single slide because not everything's going to be on your quiz at the end of the unit. So I'm not going to worry too much on that. I am going to focus on some of the terms that will be on that quiz. So you want to be able to maybe take notes on the side so that just like the last quiz we had, you have some notes that you can use that are going to be valuable to you. So once we get started, we're going to talk about the lure of the West. Why did people want to go out there? And there were two reasons: push and pull factors. We're going to talk about what that means. What is a push factor? What is a pull factor? So a push factor would be something that that pushed people to the West. Maybe something they wanted to get away from where they were living in the East. And in this case, we're looking at this slide, and it's saying Eastern farmland was expensive, especially for African Americans after the Civil War. There was religious repression, especially for the Mormons. So that it was giving them people a reason to leave the East and move to the West. So that would be a push factor. A pull factor might be what's in the West pulling people out. In this case, we're talking about land, free land practically. People could go out and buy up a bunch of land and then sell it to a bunch of other people. Other things might be a new life, jobs like in the mining, the gold mines, things like that. Um, Obviously, you can read this slide to find out some more of those answers, but we've got push and pull factors. Those are two reasons why people would move west. We've got the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, this was put into place before the end of the Civil War. But what it did is it offered 160 acres of land to anyone who was 21 years of age or older, or the head of the family, if you were an American citizen or filing for citizenship. And they would pay $10 to build a house on the land, live on that land for 6 months out of the year, and they had to farm the land for 5 years before they could claim ownership. So, I mean, that was a really good deal. People would move west. You get 160 acres. You paid $10 to build a house there. You lived there for at least 6 months, and you farmed the land for 5 years. Then you got to own all that land. That's 160 acres. That's so much land. I mean, what a great deal. So the Homestead Act is pretty important. I'm not going to ask you about that act on your test, but I may ask you what a homestead is, and that would be like a place to live in the West. The pull factor of private property. People wanted to move west to settle. So after you got to keep that land for 5 years, they were setting up what was private property. What did they get to keep? What could they extend? And that's why through the West, obviously using railways. Okay, so this is kind of important. After the Civil War, obviously a lot of immigrants moved west, especially European immigrants. They started arriving in the mid 1800s during the Civil War and after the Civil War, looking for land to farm, especially during that Homestead Act. That was kind of a big deal. So they wanted to become citizens so that they could also have the land. Also, African Americans started moving to the West to escape oppression in the South. Those people, 50,000 of them, these guys were called exodusters. I'm not going to put that on the quiz, although if we were in class, in a regular classroom, I would definitely have it on there, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with that part. They fled the South for the West to escape violence, exploitation, and segregation. Okay, so the shifting of the frontier kept moving west until it got to the West Coast, and there was no more frontier after that. We talk about the problems with the Native Americans. The West was occupied by Native Americans. The whole country had been occupied by Native Americans, and they kept getting pushed back and put on reservations. The Easterners called this the Indian problem. Now, the Indian problem was pretty much genocide. Americans were killing Indians in mass quantities, especially as Americans started moving west. And we'll talk a little bit, some of like the Sand Creek Massacre, the Massacre of Wounded Knee, some things like that. It was brutal. Life of the Plains Indians. So horses were originally brought to America by the Spanish years and years prior to this. But especially the Plains Indians, which those are the ones that were kind of down the middle of the country from North Dakota all the way down, they became nomadic, meaning they went to hunt for their food. They moved their homes, and so they needed horses to move everything to go to follow the food. And in this case, the food was buffalo. And so, obviously, as the whites kept moving west, the buffalo was decreasing and ultimately became almost extinct, where the natives would use every piece of the buffalo for things they needed, whether it was clothing, warmth, building for leather, housing, not to mention the meat and everything else, where the whites that were coming across were just using it for the pelts and the fur. Um, there were a lot of uprisings by the Indians because they wanted this all to stop, clearly. But what happened was there were so many different Indian tribes, they were not able to provide a united effort to stop the whites from moving west. And that's ultimately what became their demise, because they weren't. That's not how they lived. They weren't united as far as huge tribes were concerned. There were big ones, but not enough for all of them. Indian wars and government policy. By the 1860s, Americans had discovered that the interior concealed a treasure chest of resources. And this is where we're talking about mining, especially gold mining. Many settlers felt justified in taking Indian land because, in their view, they would make it more productive. Now, the Indians believed that nobody owned the land. People belong to the land. You don't own it. So it was really unfathomable for them to think that you were moving onto that land and tearing it apart and making it yours. You can't own land. So a lot of treaties were put into place. I mean, tons of treaties. And I don't think there is even one that was actually ever kept. And a treaty would be a promise between the Indians and the United States. They would have like a person, kind of like a go-between, like a white go-between that would maybe could speak the Indian language of a particular tribe and go back and forth. And he usually sided with the Indians. He was an advocate for them. But none of these treaties ever came to fruition, in that the Indians never got what they were told that they were going to get. So if you look down here, treaties were often misleading and even fraudulent. Many settlers stole land, killed buffalo, diverted water supplies, and attacked Indian camps. So they really were not treated well at all, even though they were told by the government that they would be. Okay, so I'm going to go past this. I would like you to read this, The Battlefield Challenges, but I'm not going to go into it too much because I want to get into the key battles. So we've got the Sand Creek Massacre, which was in 1864, just before the end of the Civil War. It's also called Shivington Massacre and the Massacre of the Cheyenne. I think on the West Coast, we really know it more as the Sand Creek Massacre. It was after being promised protection by the Colorado governor, Black Kettle, who was the chief, an Indian chief, led the Cheyenne and the Arapaho to a camp near Sand Creek. Between 150 and 500 Native Americans, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by 700 soldiers under Colonel John Shivington. They were mostly women and children and old men. And if you ever read any of the stories about this in a book, it was brutal, sickening, disgusting. It was a total massacre. And they couldn't even put up a fight. It was awful. The Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, the U.S. abandoned the Bozeman Trail and created a large Sioux reservation in what is half of South Dakota. So the Sioux is also an Indian tribe. But I want you to know that the Sand Creek Massacre will be on your quiz. Colonel George Custer, Custer's Last Stand, Battle of Little Bighorn. He reported there was gold in the Black Hills, which would be kind of in the plains, which resulted in miners overrunning the region and that was given to the Sioux Indians in the Fort Laramie Treaty. When we may learn a little bit about Little Bighorn in the slideshow, I can't remember, but if you've ever been to Bighorn, it's pretty amazing. When he was offered to buy Black Hills, Red Cloud entered into negotiations. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who had never signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, left the reservation and hostilities resumed. So if you've ever seen, what is it? Oh, I'll have to get back to that. Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull. These guys are very important men as far as the natives are concerned. The Battle of Little Big Horn, June of 1876, George Custer was sent to round up the Indians. 2,000 Sioux warriors wiped out Custer's force of 200 soldiers in less than an hour. Basically, George Custer totally screwed up. He wasn't listening to the people on his side, his troops. He wasn't listening, and he just dove down into this valley with all his guys, all 200 soldiers, and he was completely surrounded by Sioux warriors, and they just killed him. Which scared Americans because they weren't hearing that Custer was messing with them first. They were just hearing that out of nowhere, these Indians came and killed Colonel George Custer and his troops. The army flooded the area and quickly forced most of the Sioux back to their reservations. The Battle of Wounded Knee is just as awful as the Sand Creek Massacre in my mind. It had to do with the ghost dance. A prophet, Wovoka, who was a Native American, he promised to return. Everyone was going to return to their traditional life. And he performed this dance called the ghost dance. And what it was supposed to do was make white people go away. And so all these Native Americans were getting on board with the ghost dance. So many of the Sioux practiced this ghost dance. And in 1890, the government agent at Pine Ridge Reservation wired the army. This is what he said: Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. We need protection and we need it now. They were just dancing. Indian police officers tried to arrest Sitting Bull. When he hesitated, they just shot and killed him. Sitting Bull's followers surrendered and were rounded up at Wounded Knee Creek. And as the Indians were being disarmed, someone fired a shot, and they don't know who it was, probably a soldier. And then all the soldiers opened fire and killed more than 200 Sioux who were mostly unarmed in the winter and not clothed well. And it was pretty awful. They did some other awful things to the women and children and to the men, and I'm not going to go into that, but it was pretty awful. The massacre at Wounded Knee was the last major episode of violence in the Indian Wars. So you'll need to know about Wounded Knee and the Sand Creek Massacre for sure. You'll need to know push and pull factors for sure. You need to know what assimilation is, and we're going to talk about this right here. This was the U.S. attempt to get Native Americans on board as far as acting like Americans. They had to get their hair cut. They had to dress like white people. They wanted them to assimilate into the white culture. It was a slap in the face to the Native Americans. The Dawes Act was an attempt to get these natives to assimilate to American culture. I'm probably not going to test you on the Dawes Act, but assimilate will definitely be on the quiz. Homesteaders were allowed to stake claims to the land. Let's see, 55 Indian nations were forced onto Indian territory, or what is today Oklahoma, which would be a huge reservation. The hard part about that is many of the Indians that they put in Oklahoma were not used to that kind of land. The nomads needed to travel to hunt for food to find their buffalo. There was no buffalo in Oklahoma. They put some Indians there that were used to farming the land. You couldn't farm that kind of land in Oklahoma. They just put them all there. During the 1880s, as squatters overran the land, Congress agreed to buy out Indian claims to the region. So a squatter is someone who just gets on the land and stays there and won't leave, so it becomes theirs. On April 22nd, 1889, homesteaders were allowed to stake claims to the land. Now, homesteaders are the people that came out during the Homestead Act to claim the 160 free acres. Do you remember back a couple slides ago? By sundown, the settlers, called boomers, had staked claims to almost 200 million acres. Some of the best land had been taken by Sooners, people who had sneaked past the government officials. So you're going to need to know what boomers and Sooners are. And if this isn't really clear, you may have to look it up before the test, because those words will be on there as well. Under pressure from settlers, Congress created the Oklahoma Territory in 1890. Maybe you've ever heard of the Oklahoma Sooners College. Eventually, all the Indian Territory was open to settlement. Okay, I'm not going to get into this too much. And this, I may come back to this on a different day, but I'm not going to get into this with you right now. Turner's Frontier Thesis, maybe on your quiz. I can't remember off the top of my head. This is Frederick Jackson Turner was an author. And he had this idea, and that's where the thesis is. His thesis was that people needed to move west. They needed to keep moving. There needed to be a frontier. So when there was no frontier, what were these people going to do? They needed to be able to expand all the time. And they had to do that because they had to do with a lot of social issues. For instance, America had created Americas who were socially mobile, ready for adventure, bent on individual self improvement, and committed to democracy. They also needed a place for people to get away if they were criminals, if they didn't want to be in towns where they might have jail. A lot of criminals moved west to get away from jail and prison and the law. So if there's nowhere to go, then those criminals stay within society and it makes things worse. So Frederick Turner is saying, what do we do when there is no more land? He was saying that was a negative thing for our country. Well, if you remember last year, that's where imperialism comes in, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so I'm not getting into populism with you. I think I'm coming to the end of this particular slideshow. Some of this stuff, if we were in class, I would definitely be going through this with you, but seeing you for 45 minutes twice a week isn't going to cut it. So we're going to stop right there. You can revisit the slideshow to go ahead and get you some more notes if you need. Hold on to those for our test. As of now, this is the end of my slideshow. I will see you later. Bye.